Get that girl out of my sight before I have security. Drag her out like trash. The boardroom speakerphone crackled, the recorded voice of Priscilla Thorne, sharp and grating, slicing through the heavy, air-conditioned silence of United Transglobal's corporate offices on the 44th floor in Manhattan. Robert Strickland, the CEO of United Transglobal, stared at the speakerphone, his knuckles white against the edge of the solid mahogany table, his jaw set in a hard, frozen line. Around him, 20 board members sat in absolute, paralyzed silence. The room smelled of expensive, stale espresso and cold-catered pastries that had gone untouched for hours. The heavy, climate-controlled chill of the office did nothing to cool the sweat beads forming on the CFO's forehead. A digital countdown clock on the wall glowed a harsh neon green, ticking down to the 3 o'clock Eastern Wire deadline. $450 million. The Pioneer Capital Fund exit financing. It was the crucial lifeline that would pull United Transglobal out of its bankruptcy grave and keep 50,000 employees from being thrown onto the street on Monday morning. Bill, the sweating CFO, frantically tapped on his laptop, his breath shallow, his fingers slick on the keys. "The fund is not responding," Bill whispered, his voice dry and hollow in the spacious, quiet room. "The wire is locked. Pioneer Capital has frozen the transaction. How is that possible?" Strickland's voice was low, but his flared nostrils betrayed the rising panic. "The court approved the restructuring. The contracts are signed. Who authorized a freeze?" Bill didn't answer right away. He scrolled through an urgent, encrypted text, message forwarded directly from Pioneer Capital's managing partner, Samuel Reed. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wide with a terror that reached his bones. "The anchor investor pulled her commitment," Bill said, his voice trembling. "She invoked the material adverse change clause. She cited a direct, ingrained failure of corporate culture and widespread prejudice inside our operations. Without her $50 million, the entire loan syndicate has collapsed." "Who is she?" Strickland slammed his palm onto the table, the glass of water in front of him rattling. "What is her name?" Bill looked at the screen, swallowed hard, and read the name. "Sarah Mercer." Strickland's heart dropped. He had never heard the name before, but as he stared at the incident report attached to the text, a cold, sickening realization began to settle in his stomach. The report detailed an event that had occurred just hours earlier at LAX Terminal 4. A boarding conflict on United Transglobal Flight 408. A young black woman in a simple gray hoodie, removed from her first-class seat because she didn't look like she belonged. The CEO closed his eyes, his breath catching in his throat as the speakerphone crackled again, replaying the recording of Priscilla Thorne's voice, the voice that had just cost his company $450 million. The dry, warm air of the Tom Bradley International Terminal at LAX was a chaotic hum of travelers, but in the priority check-in lane for United Transglobal, the tension was concentrated and sharp. Priscilla Thorne stood at the counter, her cream-colored cashmere blazer draped elegantly over her shoulders, her wrists adorned with B. Bulgari and Cartier bracelets that rattled like dry bones with every gesture. Her face was twisted into a mask of cold, aristocratic impatience as she berated a young, exhausted check-in clerk. "I have been standing in this line for 10 minutes, Priscilla said, her voice dripping with an ingrained, deep-seated entitlement that expected immediate submission. "My husband, William, is the lead counsel for this airline's restructuring. I do not wait behind people who don't even know how to hold a Claysprite passport." Jillian Cross, the lead flight attendant for Flight 408, stood near the counter, adjusting her uniform. Instead of intervening or de-escalating the situation, Jillian smiled sympathetically at Priscilla, choosing the comfort of a wealthy, regular passenger over her professional duty. She nodded, enabling the behavior with a quiet, submissive nod. "I understand completely, Mrs. Thorne. Jillian said, her voice smooth and practiced. "We will have you processed immediately. We appreciate your patience." It was then that Sarah Mercer walked into the priority lane. She walked quietly, her shoulders relaxed, carrying a single black duffel bag and her small, worn wooden case. She was dressed in a simple, organic gray, cotton loopback hoodie from Heirloom Standard, custom jeans, and logoless white sneakers. She wore no jewelry, no flashing status symbols, but on her left wrist was a vintage steel Omega Speedmaster Professional Caliber 321 watch. Priscilla immediately reacted to Sarah's presence. She stepped back, physically, crowding Sarah's space, her expensive, heavy perfume clashing with the smell of floor wax and jet fuel. She rolled her eyes and turned her head toward Jillian, speaking in a loud, deliberate whisper that carried easily across the counter. "They really need to do a better job of keeping the queue clean," Priscilla said, her lip curling in a brief, ugly micro-expression of disgust. "It's getting ridiculous when anyone can just wander into the priority lane." Sarah did not respond. She remains as steady as a rock, her face calm, but her jaw is set. The contrast between Priscilla's performative wealth and Sarah's quiet, unforced dignity was a silent wall between them. Jillian Cross didn't look at Sarah either. She kept her eyes on Priscilla, her smile widening as she handed over her boarding pass. "We are ready for you, Mrs. Thorne. Please enjoy the lounge." Inside the exclusive first-class lounge, the world was muted and cool. The smell of fresh orchids and expensive wood polish filled the quiet, dim space. Sarah Mercer sat in a quiet corner table, her laptop open, her eyes focused on Ecclese's scrolling wall of predictive shipping algorithms. She liked the anonymity of the Praction lounge. At 28, she had built Apex Maritime into a global logistics powerhouse, but she had kept her face entirely out of the press. She preferred the quiet. Her left hand rested on her laptop keyboard, her fingers occasionally brushing the steel bezel of the vintage Omega Speedmaster Professional Caliber 321. The watch was her connection to the past. It had been a gift from her father, Thomas Mercer, a local machinist from Bridgeport, who had spent 40 years in a portiere's cold, grease-stained workshop. He had given her the watch when she graduated, his hands rough and calloused as he placed it in her palm. "Every machine tells you what's wrong, Sarah," he had told her, his voice low and steady. "The only question is whether you are humble enough to listen. Never forget how the gears align." She had never forgotten. The watch, with its visible mechanical movement, was her anchor. It reminded her of the cold metal of her father's shop, of the smell of engine oil and sawdust, of a life built on precision and hard work rather than flashing luxury. Across the lounge, Priscilla Thorne was creating a scene at the bar. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the low murmur of the room. "This is Yellow Label champagne," Priscilla snapped, her Cartier bracelets rattling as she tapped her fingernails against the marble counter. "I specifically requested the vintage reserve. I know what my husband's firm pays for our membership here, and I expect what I asked for." The bartender apologized, his hands shaking as he reached for another bottle. Sarah watched the exchange for a brief second, then looked down at her watch. She could feel the heavy, steady ticking of the caliber 321 against her wrist, its movement perfectly aligned, a quiet contrast to the loud, insecure performance across the room. She practiced the slow, methodical breathing her father had taught her, keeping her heart rate steady, her focus clear. The boarding call for United Transglobal Flight 408 was announced, the metallic chime echoing through the terminal. Sarah joined the priority queue, her duffel bag slung over her shoulder. Priscilla Thorne was directly in front of her, her cashmere blazer immaculate, her posture rigid with self-importance. The walk down the carpeted jet bridge was narrow, the air smelling of recycled cabin air and fuel. As they approached the aircraft door, Priscilla turned. She subjected Sarah to a cold, evaluative, and deeply prejudiced stare. Her eyes moved slowly from Sarah's worn white sneakers, up her gray hoodie, to her dark skin, her expression clear and dismissive. Gillian Cross was standing by the cabin door, her smile painted on. Beside her was Nigel Finch, the gate manager, a man in a polyester suit with a UTG badge pinned to his lapel. Nigel noticed the obvious tension between the two women. He saw Priscilla's tight jaw and Sarah's quiet, unmoving presence. But Nigel made a calculated, everyday decision. He chose convenience over courage. He wanted to keep the wealthy, frequent flyer happy, to avoid any uncomfortable scenes that might delay the departure. He processed Priscilla with a bright, obsequious smile, ignoring Sarah completely as if she were invisible. "Welcome aboard, Mrs. Thorne," Nigel said, bowing his head slightly. "Seat 2G. Sarah stepped forward, her face calm, her hand resting on the strap of her bag. She handed her phone to Nigel. He scanned it quickly, his eyes flicking to her hoodie with a brief, dismissive squint. But the screen beeped green. "Seat 2K, he said, his voice flat and empty. Sarah entered the aircraft, her quiet footsteps lost in the low hum of the large cabin, her father's watch ticking steadily on her wrist as she moved toward the Kamine first-class cabin, where the silent, complicit crowd was already settling into their seats. The first-class cabin of United Transglobal Flight 408 was a silent, insulated world of brushed aluminum, soft blue LED lighting, and the scent of expensive leather and fresh-cut lilies. The low, heavy vibration of the auxiliary power unit hummed beneath the floorboards, a rhythmic mechanical pulse that vibrated through Sarah Mercer's feet as she sat in seat 2K. Through the window, the tarmac of LAX was beginning to blur behind a thin sheet of rain, but inside the Pren's cabin, the temperature was kept at a cool, artificial 70 degrees. Sarah leaned her head back against the headrest, her gray organic cotton, loop-back hoodie soft against her neck. She pulled her tablet from her backpack and rested it on her lap, her fingers moving across the screen as she reviewed the vessel transit times for Apex Maritime's Atlantic routes. On her left wrist, her father's vintage steel, Omega Speedmaster Professional Caliber 321 ticked in, a steady, unbroken cadence, its mechanical heartbeat, a quiet reminder of his Bridgeport machine shop, the smell of motor oil, the cold iron, and the absolute focus required to keep a system in alignment. Across the aisle in seat 2G, Priscilla Thorne settled into her leather pod. Her Bulgari perfume, heavy and sweet, drifted across the cabin, clashing with the clean, neutral scent of the air conditioning. Her Cartier and Bulgari bracelets rattled against her armrest as she pulled out her phone. Her eyes immediately took in the hood, the casual denim, and the simple logoless white sneakers. Priscilla leaned forward, pressuring the service call button. Within 10 seconds, Gillian Cross, the lead flight attendant, appeared. Her uniform was immaculate, her hair pinned back in a tight, professional bun, but her eyes were already scanning the cabin, calculating how to manage the comfort of her most lucrative passengers. Priscilla did not lower her voice as she leaned toward Gillian, her hand gesturing vaguely in Sarah's direction. "Gillian, are we fully booked in first class today? I was under the impression this cabin was reserved for our tier of passengers. I don't feel entirely comfortable with the seating arrangement. It's a matter of safety." Gillian's smile remained pinned to her face, but her eyes flicked to Sarah, then back to Priscilla. She made an immediate, career-driven choice. She knew William Thorne was a powerful figure in the airline's bankruptcy council. She knew what Priscilla's patronage meant to her performance reviews. She did not see a late passenger in seat 2K. She saw a variable that was disrupting the comfort of her most important customer. "I understand completely, Mrs. Thorne," Gillian whispered, her voice a smooth, submissive purr. "Let me double-check the manifest. I'll make sure everything in order." Jillian straightened her jacket and took 3 slow, deliberate steps across the blank aisle, her shoes clicking softly on the carpet. She stopped in front of Sarah's pod, her posture polite but rigid, her shadow falling over the technical schematics on Sarah's tablet. "Ma'am," Jillian said, her voice carrying a sugar-coated condescension. We're going to need to see your boarding pass again. There seems to be an issue with the seating assignments." The cabin went quiet. It wasn't an abrupt silence, but a slow, heavy settling of attention. In seat 2A, Gregory Harrison slowly lowered his financial paper. He looked at Sarah, then at Gillian, then at the rattling bracelets on Priscilla's wrist. He knew exactly who Sarah Mercer was. He knew her net worth exceeded his own by several $billion. But Gregory Harrison did not move. He did not speak. He slowly raised his paper back up, hiding his face, choosing the comfortable safety of silence over the social awkwardness of a confrontation. Beside him, another passenger, a tech startup founder, turned away, staring intently at his phone screen to avoid eye contact. At the back of the first-class cabin, 2 older women in matching designer knitwear whispered to each other, their heads nodding in quiet, complicit agreement with Priscilla. They looked at Sarah's hoodie, and then at each other, their silent expressions confirming that she simply did not fit the brand of the UTG first-class experience. Priscilla Thorne leaned further out of her seat, her voice rising in pitch. Her bracelets clashing like armor. "I saw her in the lounge, Jillian. She was staring at me, acting highly aggressive. I'm a million-mile flyer with this airline, and I will not be subjected to this kind of hostility. She doesn't belong in this cabin, and you know it." Sarah Mercer did not flinch. Her hands remained completely still on her lap, her fingers loose over her tablet. She did not raise her voice, nor did she look at Priscilla. She turned her head toward Jillian, her green eyes calm, heavy, and steady as stone. "My boarding pass is on my phone," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a low, quiet level that carried the weight of an unmovable object. "The gate agent scanned it 5 minutes ago. The seat is 2K. Jillian's tight smile did not waver, but her nostrils flared slightly. "Yes, dear, but we have a policy regarding cabin security and passenger comfort. If another guest feels unsafe, we have to address it. I'm going to need you to unlock your phone and show me the QR code again." Sarah looked down at her watch. The caliber 321 ticked on. She remembered her father's voice in the quiet of his Bridgeport shop. "Stay grounded when the Devonty Devonty end. Machine starts to shake, Sarah. Let them show you where the gears are loose." She unlocked her phone and held up the screen. The QR code glowed under the Prosen cabin lights. The chime of the cabin intercom rang, and the side door of the aircraft opened. Nigel Finch, the gate manager, walked into the first-class cabin. His polyester suit jacket was slightly rumpled, his tie crooked, and he carried the stale smell of airport coffee and cold sweat. He had been summoned by Gillian, and he walked with the frantic, hurried stride of a middle manager desperate to resolve a problem before it delayed his departure schedule. Nigel stopped beside Gillian, looking at Sarah, then at Priscilla, who was now sighing dramatically into her silk handkerchief. "What's the issue here, Gillian?" Nigel asked, his voice hushed but urgent. "Mrs. Thorne has expressed concern over her safety, Mr. Finch," Gillian said, her voice carrying a practiced, defensive weight. "This passenger in 2K is refusing to cooperate with our standard security verification. She has been hostile." "I am not being hostile," Sarah said, her voice quiet, flat, and absolute. "I showed her my boarding pass. It is valid." Nigel didn't look at the phone. He looked at Sarah's heirloom standard gray hoodie, her worn sneakers, and her simple black duffel bag. He looked at Priscilla's cashmere blazer and the diamond rings glittering on her fingers. He made the same calculations his staff had made. He saw a young black woman who didn't look like she had the resources to fight back, and a wealthy frequent flyer whose husband held the keys to the airline's legal survival. "Ma'am," Nigel said, stepping closer, his voice hard. "I'm going to need you to stand up. We need to conduct a physical search of your bag, and then we're going to have to ask you to step off the aircraft." Across the aisle, Miriam Clark, a 40-year-old pediatric nurse on her way to visit her mother, felt her chest tighten. She knew Sarah hadn't done anything wrong. She had watched Sarah sit in her seat, working quietly, since she boarded. Miriam's hands gripped her purse, her knuckles turning white. She wanted to stand up. She wanted to tell Nigel Finch that he was making an illegal, bigoted mistake. But she looked at the uniform. She looked at the other, wealthy passengers who were staring in silence, and she felt the heavy, suffocating pressure of social conformity. She stayed in her seat. She looked away, her heart hammering against her ribs, her silence making her an accomplice to the scene. "Search my bag?" Sarah asked, her hand resting on the vintage Omega. "On what grounds? Standard security protocol?" Nigel lied, his voice rising. "We have a report of a disturbance. Open the bag, or I will have airport police remove you forcibly." Sarah did not argue. She stood up slowly, her tall, thin frame straight and unmoving. She reached into the overhead bin, pulled down her black duffel bag, and set it on the seat. She unzipped it, revealing her simple belongings: a change of clothes, a technical book on maritime logistics, and her father's worn leather machinist notebook with his hand-drawn gear schematics. Nigel went through her things, his hands rough as he tossed her clothes aside. He found nothing. No weapons, no drugs, no contraband. Just the simple tools of a woman who valued intellect over flash. "Nothing here, Nigel," Jillian whispered, her voice dropping. Nigel didn't apologize. He zipped the bag back up and handed it to Sarah. "We still have a passenger comfort issue, ma'am. You're going to have to deplane. We can rebook you on Flight 512 to JFK tonight. It leaves at 10:45 p.m. We can offer you a seat in Economy Plus and a $15 meal voucher for your trouble." Sarah Mercer stood in the aisle of Flight 408. She did not yell. She did not plead. She did not invoke her wealth or her position as the majority shareholder of the Pioneer Capital Fund. She simply looked at Nigel Finch, her green eyes holding his with a quiet, terrifying intensity that made his breath catch in his throat. "A $15 voucher," Sarah said, her voice a low, heavy weight in the silent cabin, "and an economy seat on a red-eye. That's the best we can do under the circumstances, ma'am," Nigel said, his voice tightening as he tried to maintain his manager's mask. "We need to close the cabin door. Now, please walk toward the exit." Sarah slung her duffel bag over her shoulder. She looked across the aisle at Priscilla Thorne, who was smirking behind her silk handkerchief, her Cartier bracelets rattling as she took a slow sip of her champagne. She looked at Jillian, who stood with her arms crossed, her painted smile back in place, satisfied that she had protected her target demographic. She looked at the other passengers, at Gregory Harrison, who was still staring at his financial paper, and at the others who looked away in active, shameful cowardice. She let the silence hold for 5 full seconds, her father's Speedmaster ticking in the quiet air. "Nigel," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried to the very back of first class. "You are making a catastrophic mistake. You just haven't realized it yet." She turned her back on them. She walked down the center aisle, her steps slow, deliberate, and unhurried. Her sneakers made no sound on the carpet, but her presence was a quiet storm as she walked out of the cabin, through the galley, and stepped back onto the narrow, cold jet bridge. Behind her, the heavy oak-paneled door of Flight 408 clicked shut, sealing them in their golden temporary world, while the countdown on their survival went to 0. Sarah Mercer walked out of the boarding gate, her gray heirloom standard hoodie pulled low over her face. She navigated the crowded corridors of the Tom Bradley International Terminal, her footsteps rhythmic and unhurried as she searched for a quiet space away from the flow of passengers. She found an alcove near a charging station, the low, steady hum of the airport's ventilation system providing a buffer of white noise. She sat on a cold, modular bench, set her black duffel bag on the floor, and pulled out her secure, titanium-cased phone. Her left hand rested flat on her knee, the vintage steel of her father's caliber 321 watch cool against her wrist, its tiny internal gears moving in perfect, invisible alignment. She unlocked the screen and pressed the speed dial for Samuel Reed. Sarah. Samuel's voice was instant, carrying the crisp, sharp energy of his forces. Manhattan office. You should be in the air. Did the flight depart early? I'm still at LAX, Samuel, Sarah said, her voice flat, level, and entirely devoid of anger. I've been removed from the flight. She delivered the data points with clinical precision, her words cold and hairy assess. Objective. She described the boarding process, the flight attendant Jillian Cross, the gate manager Nigel Finch, the seat assignments of 2K and 2G, and the specific elite-minded microaggressions used by Priscilla Thorne. She detailed the public search of her bag, the offer of an economy seat on a late-night red-eye, and the $15 meal voucher. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. Sarah could hear the faint, rapid click of Samuel's keyboard, a mechanical clatter that sounded like a machine resetting its coordinates. GAA, or rather United Trans Global, is in the final hours of its restructuring, Samuel said, his voice dropping several degrees. The Pioneer Capital Fund is scheduled to wire the $450 million exit financing in exactly 40 minutes. We are the anchor limited partner in that fund, Sarah. We committed $50 million. Our presence was the signal that brought in the other LPs. Without our capital, the syndicate defaults on its obligation to UTG. Freeze the commitment, Sarah said, her hand tightening around the phone. Invoke the Material Adverse Change Clause. Cite a widespread ingrained failure of corporate governance and a direct act of racial discrimination by the beneficiary of the fund. If we pull out now, the syndicate collapses, Samuel said, his voice containing no hesitation, only the cold calculation of a financial executioner. UTG's restructuring will fail. They will be insolvent by Monday morning. We are talking about Chapter 7 liquidation. They will have to sell their fleet for scrap. Then let them, Sarah said. They are a liability. Their internal controls are non-existent, and they employ people who make decisions based rather than policy. I have lost confidence in their ability to protect my investment or their passengers' dignity. Pull the money, Samuel, and let the wire fail. Consider it done, Samuel replied. I'll have a private car meet you at the PROS terminal and transfer you to the private airfield. Your Gulfstream will be spooled and ready in 60 minutes. In New York, the digital countdown clock on the boardroom wall ticked down toward 3 o'clock. Robert Strickland, the CEO of United Trans Global, stared at his laptop screen. His knuckles were white, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles in his cheek throbbed. The heavy, air-conditioned chill of the office did nothing to stop the cold sweat running down his collar. Beside him, Bill, the CFO, was staring at his phone, his eyes wide with absolute bone-deep panic. The wire has been blocked, Bill whispered, his hand shaking as he showed his screen to Strickland. Pioneer Capital has officially withdrawn. The syndicate is dead, Robert. The $450 million is gone. What do you mean, gone? Strickland roared, his voice cracking. Who pulled out? The Anchor LP, Bill said, his breath shallow. The Vance family office? No, the Turner Trust. Sarah Mercer. She pulled her $50 million. The fund can't close. Without it, we are in default. Before Strickland could answer, his private line buzzed. He grabbed the receiver, his hands slick with sweat. Strickland. Robert? It's William Thorne. The voice on the other end was a frantic, high-pitched scream. William Thorne was the airline's lead restructuring counsel, the man who had spent 2 years building the Blackstone and Pioneer deals. Do you know what just happened? My wife Priscilla had a passenger removed from Flight 408 at LAX. That passenger was Sarah Mercer. Strickland's heart stopped. She is the anchor investor. William? Strickland said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, empty whisper. She just froze our entire exit financing. We are insolvent. My wife didn't know. William sobbed. She thought she was some girl in a hoodie. Robert, please, can we call her? Can we apologize? Apologize? Strickland's voice rose to a guttural scream of absolute ruin. Apologize for what? Your wife threw away a $70 billion airline because she didn't like a hoodie. We file for Chapter 7 on Monday morning. William, your career is over. My career is over. We are finished. 3,000 miles away, high above the Mojave Desert, United Transglobal, Flight 408, was climbing through 20,000 feet. The chime of the cockpit intercom rang. The captain, a veteran pilot named Greg Bennett, picked up the receiver. The message from dispatch was short, encrypted, and carried a company emergency code he had never seen in 3 decades of flying. UTG 408, land immediately. Nearest suitable airfield, Las Vegas. Company, emergency. Do not proceed to JFK. Confirm. The captain stared at the screen, his face blank with confusion. He looked at his first officer. What is this? The captain muttered. We're showing no mechanical failures. No. Weather issues. It's a company priority, Cap, the first officer said, checking his instruments. They want us on the ground. Now, the captain keyed the mic, his voice flat. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain speaking. We are experiencing an unforeseen company emergency and will be diverting to Las Vegas immediately. Please remain in your seats with your seat belts fastened. In seat 2G, Priscilla Thorne's champagne glass rattled against her tray table as the A320 made a steep, aggressive bank to the left. The soft golden light of the Priant cabin seemed to dim as the plane began its rapid descent toward the desert floor. Her phone buzzed as the in-flight Wi-Fi connected, a torrent of frantic, screaming text messages from her husband filling her screen. Priscilla, what did you do? The deal is dead. We are ruined. The plane touched down at Harry Reid International Airport in Las Vegas 20 minutes later, rolling past the private jets to a remote, dusty stand on the far edge of the airfield. As soon as the engine spooled down, the forward cabin door was opened. It wasn't a gate agent who stepped through. It was 2 senior GAA executives who had been scrambled from the local terminal and 3 armed airport police officers. They walked straight into the first-class cabin, their eyes locking on Priscilla Thorne in seat 2G. Priscilla Thorne? The lead executive asked, his voice cold, flat, and absolute. Yes? She said, her voice small, her fingers trembling as she clutched her leather handbag. You will stand up and step off this aircraft immediately, the executive said, his nostrils flaring with contempt. You made a false security report. You caused a direct, malicious disruption of our operations and the insolvency of this airline. Officers, remove her. Priscilla was marched down the aisle, her Bulgari and Cartier bracelets rattling like dry bones in the silent cabin. The other first-class passengers watched in absolute, paralyzed silence. Gregory Harrison, the venture capitalist who had stayed quiet in his seat at LAX, refused to look at her as she passed. He knew what her arrogance had cost them all. At LAX, Nigel Finch and Gillian Cross were in the employee break room, packing their lockers. Two security guards stood in the doorway, their faces flat, their arms crossed. Their badges had already been confiscated, their access codes deactivated, their careers in the aviation industry ended in a single 3-minute phone call from the corporate offices in Chicago. Nigel looked at Gillian. His hand was shaking so hard, he dropped his car keys onto the floor. "She was a billionaire, Gillian," Nigel whispered, his voice a dry, hollow echo of his former confidence. "The girl in the hoodie. She owned the whole thing." Gillian didn't answer. She sat on the bench, staring at the floor, her painted smile gone, her face gray under the harsh fluorescent lights of the break room. In her Manhattan penthouse, Sarah Mercer sat by the window, the city lights of New York stretching out like a vast grid of glowing microchips below her. Her father's watch ticked on her wrist, a steady mechanical pulse that anchored her. In the quiet, the news of United Trans Global's Chapter 7 liquidation was flashing across the Bloomberg terminal on her desk. The 80-year-old airline was officially dead, its assets to be sold at auction on Monday morning. 50,000 employees were out of work. She called Samuel Reed. "Samuel," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying the heavy weight of a rock. "I want the $50 million we pulled from the Pioneer Capital Fund reallocated immediately." "Reallocated where?" Samuel asked, his keyboard silent as he waited. "We are going to establish the Mercer Transition Fund," Sarah said. $100 million. I want severance packages, health insurance extensions, and job placement services secured for every single laid-off UTG employee, from the baggage handlers to the reservation agents. She paused, looking out at the East River, and by their newest A320s and their transcontinental routes out of the liquidation auction on Monday. "We are launching a new carrier, Apex Air." "Sarah," Samuel corrected himself, a quiet respect in his voice. "An airline is a massive undertaking. It's a logistics problem, Samuel," Sarah said, her voice dropping. "And I'm very, very good at logistics. But this one will be run on my father's 8 principles. We don't care what our passengers wear, we care who they are. And we will never make a customer feel like they don't belong." 6 months to the day after the door of Flight 408 had clicked shut at LAX, the LAX Tom Bradley International Terminal was alive with a different kind of energy. The scuffed floors, the chaotic crowds, and the mechanical roar of aircraft remained the same, but Gate 112 was entirely transformed. The tired burgundy and twee, gray branding of the defunct United Trans Global was gone, replaced by a deep, Starfield midnight blue and a sharp digital silver. The media presence was massive, a dense wall of cameras, microphones, and journalists from the country's top financial and lifestyle publications. They weren't just covering the launch of a new airline, they were documenting the tame conclusion of a story that had captured the public imagination. The $70 billion hoodie had become an instant case study in business. School's proof that a company's internal culture was its most valuable asset, or its most catastrophic, bone-deep liability. On the tarmac sat a brand-new Airbus A320, its paint gleaming under the California sun. This was the inaugural flight of Apex Air, Flight 001, bound for JFK. The aircraft had been purchased out of the liquidation auction, stripped to its bare aluminum, and entirely rebuilt with a single design principle: dignity. Inside the cabin, the old 3-tier class division had been dismantled. In its place was a layout designed for human comfort. Solace, featuring private, quiet pods for working or resting, and Connect, a premium economy space with more legroom than UTG's old first-class cabin. The entire aircraft was configured to make passengers feel like guests, not variables on a ledger. Sarah Mercer was on board, but she wasn't sitting in Solace Pod 2K. She sat in Connect Seat 18C, an aisle seat in the middle of the cabin, her laptop open on her tray table. She wore her simple, gray, heirloom standard hoodie and worn sneakers, her fingers moving across her keyboard as she reviewed the initial boarding metrics of the new airline. On her left wrist, her father's Speedmaster, caliber 321, ticked in a steady, quiet rhythm, its mechanical gears aligned in perfect, unforced harmony. A young flight attendant named Elena, who had been hired from the wreckage of the UTG bankruptcy, approached her row. Her uniform was a comfortable, dark blue pantsuit, her face warm with a genuine enthusiasm she hadn't felt in years. She recognized Sarah, her hands trembling slightly as she held a tray with a single cup of black coffee. "Miss Mercer," Elena said quietly, her voice steady but respectful, "can I get you anything else? Some water and—" "The coffee is perfect, Elena." "Thank you," Sarah said, giving her a quiet, warm smile. As Elena leaned in to hand her the cup, a young passenger in a bright yellow, oversized hoodie, his large headphones pushed around his neck, came rushing down the aisle, eager to reach the restroom before takeoff. He wasn't paying attention, his shoulder clipping Elena's arm. The collision was sharp. The cup tilted, and hot black coffee splashed across Elena's sleeve onto the floor, and directly onto Sarah's hands and her open, custom laptop. The cabin went dead silent. The kid froze, his eyes wide with shock as he realized what he had done. "Oh my God," the kid stammered, his face turning pale. "I'm so sorry. I didn't. I see you. I am so sorry." Elena's face drained of color. This was her first flight with the new airline, her first day back in the air, after months of uncertainty. She had just spilled hot coffee on the billionaire founder, who had shut down an entire corporation over a bad customer experience. She stood frozen in absolute terror, waiting for the wrath she had been trained by her previous employers to expect. Sarah Mercer looked at her wet hands, then at the steaming keyboard of her laptop. She looked at the terrified young passenger, and then at the paralyzed flight attendant. And then she laughed. It was a quiet, warm, and breathy laugh that instantly broke the suffocating all-in and tension in the cabin. "Well," Sarah said, picking up a napkin from her tray table and daily wiping the process liquid from her hands. "That is one way to get my attention." She looked at Elena, her green eyes filled with a reassuring, unforced kindness. "Don't worry, Elena. It's a spill-proof keyboard. I learned that lesson the hard way in my college dorm room. Are you okay?" The coffee was hot. "Ah, yes, Miss Mercer. I'm so sorry," Elena whispered, her breath finally returning, her chest rising and falling as the sheer relief washed over her. "No need to apologize," Sarah said gently. "Accidents happen. Let's just get some more napkins and clean this up." She turned her head toward the young passenger in the yellow hoodie, who was still standing in the aisle, completely bewildered by her reaction. "It's just coffee, kid," Sarah said, her voice holding the quiet weight of a rock. "We're good. Cool hoodie, by the way." The kid stared for a second, then let out a massive, relieved grin. "Thanks," he muttered, sheepishly continuing down the aisle. The cabin buzzed with a low, warm murmur of conversation. The passengers who had held their breath now turned back to their seats, smiling, realizing that the stories about the new airline's culture weren't just a marketing campaign. The first flight of Apex Air was moving forward, not with the cold, rigid performance of wealth, but with the quiet grace of a system built on mutual respect. Sarah Mercer continues her quiet, everyday life in her Bridgeport apartment, the mechanical ticking of her father's Speedmaster caliber 321 a constant, comforting rhythm against her skin. The $100 million Mercer Transition Fund has successfully retrained and placed thousands of former UTG employees, while Apex Air has grown into a highly successful, human-centered alternative in the sky. She still irons her own clothes on Sunday mornings and dines at the same local diner, her connection to her father's memory and her quiet humility entirely intact. A woman who proved that true power never needs to shout. Priscilla Thorne, in stark contrast, lives in permanent, isolated obscurity in a presolated obscurity, small rented cottage in New Jersey. Her marriage to William ended by a swift, unmerciful divorce after the prenuptial agreement was nullified due to her public misconduct. Her Cartier and Bulgari bracelets are gone, sold to pay the Carringdo initial wave of her legal fees, leaving her to face the long, silent days with nothing but the memory of her own arrogance. She is a pariah in the old money, circles she once prized. Her name, a permanent warning in the industry about the Salmon Biete, catastrophic cost of unexamined prejudice. On the runway at LAX, a silver Apex Airjet taxis toward the sky, its engines quiet, its livery catching the golden morning light. It rises into the clouds, not to prove its dominance, but to remind the world that dignity has no price tag and that some lessons, though expensive, are always worth learning. If this story of unforced dignity and quiet justice made you stop and think about who really holds power, please hit the like button and share it with someone who needs it. Make sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story of truth hiding in plain sight.